Okay, thank you very much for the applause. I appreciate it. It's unfortunate that we're really here tonight at all, and it is unfortunate that I am the centre of attention, because really, if we were doing what we should be doing, we should all be at home living our lives, not in fear, not being prejudiced against, and quite frankly, the sooner we get back to the way we were, not the new normal, but the old normal, the better. And can I just acknowledge Jewel tonight for inviting me here. She's always been a big supporter of mine, and I appreciate all the support that she gives me. I should also acknowledge Malcolm Roberts in the crowd. Malcolm's a good friend and colleague of mine down in Canberra. And I've got a few other friends, Greenie, Soraya, wherever you are. But anyway, let's get down to the main point why we're here tonight. And it's a bit unusual. I'm not used to giving a speech about something whereby we're talking more about the fear and repression. Normally when I stand up, I like to give the reasons why I ran for politics. And the first and foremost reason why I ran was to make sure that we give our opportunity. I'm driven by the gratitude of our forefathers who've given us so many opportunities to make sure that our children get the same opportunities that our forefathers gave to us. And it's very important, if we are to do that, is to basically, appeal to our children's their hopes, and promote self-belief. And if you read my maiden speech, I brought a couple of copies along tonight. I really talked about the importance of self-belief, respecting your elders, and that inner drive. And that's really the way forward. I often think today of schools as being more like fear factories, where we're constantly telling them, teaching our kids and infecting our kids with everything that could go wrong, rather than teaching them about how beautiful the world really is, how wonderful mankind is, and there's no substitute for things like hard work, reward for effort, etc., etc. The other couple of things I'll just touch on before I get into the topic, I guess, is I also want to make sure that we stand up for Australians who try to stand up for themselves. For me, I don't see politics through the prism of left versus right. I see it through the prism of big versus small. And ultimately, democracies and, I think mankind and a good society is driven by the individual. Those people who get up every day and put their nose to the grindstone and try and stand on their own 2 feet. Because, we often throw the word around freedom, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. And I get a little bit annoyed with it sometimes, especially with some of my colleagues who use it a lot and suddenly have gone missing in action, hint, hint. But true freedom is the independence and standing on your own 2 feet. If you go to work and you've got a job and, you earn a wage and you can pay off your house and don't have a mortgage, that is a long way towards going toward, being free. And, I know that a lot of people, and it's probably very pertinent at the moment with the doctors and nurses, who basically being, extremely censored by AHPRA, the Australian Health Prudential Regulation. I'm sure there's a lot of doctors and nurses out there that would love to quit their jobs or speak out. Well, not quit their jobs, speak out. But they know that, they're going to lose their income and they're going to lose their house and their mortgage. So I don't want to be, I'm very sympathetic to what's going on out there in the medical community. I've spoken to a lot of doctors and nurses who are very frustrated. They're still employed, particularly doctors, they've spent 6 years studying at university, another couple of years becoming a GP, for example, and another couple of years in their speciality. So it's very difficult to just walk away from that. I mean, I went to a college at university, Queensland University, and I resided on a college with guys my age who did medicine, and I can well remember seeing them in their early 30s. I'd already been overseas for 7 years, coming back, and they were still studying to be optometrists or dermatologists or surgeons or paediatricians. So they're in a very tight spot at the moment, and that's why I'm more than happy to speak up for them. And of course, the other reason why we've got here tonight, and this is always the third reason why I ran for politics, and I think it's become apparent in the last 18 months, is that in the last 40 years, governments have walked away from their responsibility of providing essential services to the people. And they've done that because they've privatised all that infrastructure that was built and paid for by our parents. And our parents built that so that they would leave, their children, us, and our children, something behind. Because the best way to ensure the sovereignty of a country is to basically make sure that we control our own sovereign wealth. And when it comes to things like monopolistic infrastructure, that provides essential services, generates income from those essential services, it's very important that governments have a say in the running of that. And when we've sold that, it's either gone to foreign investors or superannuation funds. There's no accountability over how that infrastructure is run, and that also undermines the democratic process. And of course, what's happened is since all that infrastructure has been sold, what we've seen is governments, and in particular bureaucrats, they've walked away from that responsibility of providing essential services, and they've marched on into the family home, the classroom, the bedroom, the corporate boardroom via superannuation, and in the last 18 months, they've even walked into the hospitals and the doctor's surgery, telling people how to live their lives. And it is not the role of government to regulate, it is the role of government to serve the people and protect the people. I have a running battle with my colleagues in the Liberal Party because I call myself the last standing protectionist. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the initial, the first party in Australia, Barton and Deakin, they were protectionists, and then they did a deal with George Reid, who was from the Free Trade Party. In about 1903, 1904, they've had to form a coalition to get the numbers to form government, and they called that the Fusion Party. And effectively, the Liberal Party for a long time was full of a lot of protectionists, but unfortunately, in the last 40 years, we've seen those protectionists disappear to the extent now that somehow the word protectionism is seen as a bad word. And I make no apology for standing up as a politician, wanting to protect my country, wanting to protect our children, wanting to protect your jobs, and wanting to protect our values. And I don't think that that's something we should be shy of. And that's not, a lot of people like to see protectionism as though you want to limit trade overseas. I mean, I'm all for increasing trade and exports overseas. I mean, we should always be trying to sell more goods overseas. But at the same time, we should never trade that, give up our ability to be self-resilient and stand on our own 2 feet as a nation. And we don't want to get to the point whereby, for example, we can't make enough masks, or we don't have enough petrol or fuel, or even, in terms of military, I think we'd be a bit rich to think we can never be completely independent as a military nation because we are so small and isolated. But, even in that regard as well, we have to try and be as independent as possible. Which leads us to the debacle that we've basically, come to in the last 18 months. I mean, when I signed up to be a politician 2.5 years ago, I did not sign up to be part of a government and see our state governments erode civil liberties to the extent that they have over the last 18 months. I mean, we originally shut down, and I was always a bit windy from the get-go, I'll be honest, and I was probably, I sent a few text messages on the day we shut down and over that weekend saying, why are we doing this? This is a bit rough. But, originally I think it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and here we are 18 months later, and it's three jabs to keep your job, 3 jabs to, I say 3 jabs because let's face it, if we don't stop this, we're going to be forced to get boosters. 3 jabs to even go out and eat. The level of discrimination is effectively out of control. Look, whilst in many respects, I mean, I don't want to start trying to work out who's to blame. I think we're all to blame. The premiers have just, I think how a lot of this came about was because of the bushfires, whereby we didn't stand up and say, hang on a minute, bushfires has always been a state government responsibility. They're the ones who run state emergency services. They're the ones that do the zoning. They're the ones that run national parks, right? When those bushfires broke out in 2020, look, we were going through a bad drought, but we didn't start the fire, as Billy Joel would say. Bushfires occur, and we needed to make it very clear that, this is a state government responsibility. And we didn't do that. And then as a result of that, when COVID broke out, I think the Prime Minister felt like, well, I want everyone at the table here. I want to be seen working together. And while I think it was set up, this National Cabinet was set up with good intentions, I think it quickly evaporated through politics, by the state premiers, and then ourselves not standing up to the state premiers soon enough and putting them back in their box, quite frankly. So gradually we've just seen that slow creep. I can remember when I think there was first talk of the vaccine, and when it first came out, we were only going to give it to people above 50, and then gradually the age group got lowered. The trials were rushed. I mean, I've got an article that was came out last year in September where the WHO actually said that the vaccine wouldn't even be ready by the middle of this year. And yet 6 weeks later, after Biden was elected, within a week, I think there were 2 companies that said they'd had a vaccine for the coronavirus, even though they hadn't been able to find one in the last 40 years. I've got a little bit of experience in the biotech sector just through personal investing in drug companies for cancer, cancer drugs. And obviously if you get cancer, you've got a much higher chance of dying from cancer than you do from COVID for most of the population. And those trials take years. They take years. I also did a partial science degree, actually, and it was biochemistry that I was always interested in. I still am. So I was always a bit sceptical at the speed at which it was rushed out. But look, I was equivocal at first. I figured, well, we'll give it a go. And my initial view was, look, there's a low risk of dying from COVID. There's a low risk of dying from the vaccine. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You need to speak to your doctor. And you get diagnosed and you make that decision with your doctor. It's none of our business. We make the vaccine available. As time has gone on, I've seen more and more coercion, which always makes me very suspicious, especially with something so intensely personal as needles going into your body. And it would have been different if it had been something like tetanus or something that we'd all had before that we knew was safe. But the new technology, the mRNA technology, I always felt, we needed to give it a lot longer trial. And anyway, but after, particularly in the last 6 weeks, as I've heard the stories come out, I'm convinced that, I'm of the view that we really need to reassess whether that vaccine rollout should continue, because I've seen so many adverse events from younger people. I wouldn't want to give a complete blanket, say, don't do it. I hate to tell people what to do, but I think we need to be incredibly honest about the risks, especially for young people, given that their risks of dying from COVID or getting severely ill from COVID if they're young, fit and healthy. And young is obviously a relative term. I'm 51 and I still think I'm young. So, but certainly, relatively, on a relative risk basis, we need to be more honest about that. This whole blanket mandate, blanket coercion, everyone get it. And not only that, I spoke to a doctor today actually, and I think he summed it up best. He said, the doctors have been gagged in all of this. And yet all the people who aren't experts, like politicians and celebrities and the people at Bunnings, they're the ones giving the vaccine advice. And I spoke to another doctor earlier this week who was incredibly frustrated by the fact that people weren't being told to get diagnosed first, because a lot of people have genuine medical reasons why they can't get the vaccine. And I think it's incredibly unprofessional and reckless to be just saying, get the jab. It's just so, they've just broken it down into such a simple slogan that it's an insult to people, and it's effectively reckless. So, so look, I got to the point, I found out a few weeks ago, it all sort of came to a head for me. I was always getting sceptical. I was never happy with the coercion or anything like that. When the exit target first came out, I thought it's good they've got an exit target, but I didn't realise it was going to become an excuse to start just demonising people and keeping borders shut indefinitely and locking people out. So my initial frustration, I had a lot of frustrations, right? I have a lot of frustrations in this job all the time, but the one that really annoyed me about 6 weeks ago was when Queenslanders were being locked out of Queensland, and there's thousands of them being treated as refugees in their own country. And the incredibly annoying thing about that is that I don't understand why, and I don't think this needs to continue forever either, but if you got tested negative to COVID, then you shouldn't be detained at all. I mean, I come back from Canberra. By the time I go to Canberra next week, I've got 2 weeks in Canberra. I come back and do another 2 weeks of quarantine. By the time I get out of that, I would have spent 15 weeks in quarantine or Canberra in the last 20 weeks. And for every 2 weeks I go to Canberra, I've got to do another 2 weeks in quarantine. And so I'm not even doing the job that you guys pay me to do because I'm stuck in quarantine. Well, I am. I'm sort of doing it via social media and electronically, but it's just, this is ridiculous. If you test negative, I do a test before I fly down and I do a test before I fly back, just in case it goes around the plane. But that's it. And if you test negative, as far as I'm concerned, they've got no right to detain you. I mean, they don't really have a right to detain you anyway. But I mean, I'm happy to, in the spirit of nature, say, well, you've got COVID, stay at home for a certain period of time, whatever. I mean, we don't want to spread it around more than we have to. But, it's completely ridiculous to be detaining people for 14 days. And it really grinds my gears on another level because we keep hearing how this PCR test is the gold standard testing. So if it's the gold standard testing, why won't you trust it instead of locking us up for 14 days? It's this, And then, of course, the other thing is, if you test negative gold standard testing and then you've still got to wear the mask as well. I mean, and if the masks are so effective, why do you need to be vaccinated? There isn't one level where it's just, we'll just, shut everything out. And the masks are particularly frustrated because when COVID did break out, Queensland Health, the World Health Organisation, a lot of people said you don't even need to wear masks. And that's all changed in the last 18 months. Now, an airborne virus is an airborne virus. I would have thought they would have had a good enough understanding of it in March 2020. We'd come a long way by March 2020. I don't see that there would have been any new technology to come up with a different, to change the rules halfway through. So, but anyway, look, we need to get out of this, right? Enough's enough. And so where I got to the point where I just thought I can't do this anymore was the vaccine injuries. And about 4 weeks ago, I had 3 conversations with 3 different people. One was Chantelle from Western Australia, a lovely 37-year-old policewoman, dedicated to her job, loves her job. She got the Pfizer shot. She was seeing the doctor every second day for about 3 weeks and finally had a stroke on the 23rd day after getting Pfizer. She has been in and out of hospital ever since. So that was, I think, late August or sometime in September. So she's been in and out of hospital for the last 2 months. She was in hospital about 3 weeks ago for 3 days, and she had 18 IV inject drips in that 3-day period, including potassium. I spoke to her again today. She's back in hospital again today. She's going to get a gallbladder taken out tomorrow. It's a gallbladder, so I think it's getting taken out, or they're operating on a gallbladder. I think they're taking it out. Now, she was beat up on Tuesday by the West Australian who accused her of spreading COVID misinformation. Chantelle doesn't smoke, she doesn't drink, she rides horses, she's extremely fit. She knows her body, right? She was immediately ill 15 minutes after taking that vaccine. It is bad enough. And then what's worse is she put a post up about her experience on Facebook, and the police force made her take it down and threaten disciplinary action, right? Now, it is bad enough to be told by your government that the vaccine is safe and effective, right? But it is worse when something happens and you are shunned by the very people that not only have lied to you, but are meant to protect you and stand up for you. Now, we have heard from the premiers and the Prime Minister for the last 18 months that they're going to keep us safe, more so the premiers. But keeping you safe isn't just keeping you safe from COVID, it's keeping you safe from everything. And these people deserve to be treated with respect. And quite frankly, they've been treated like worse than animals. We wouldn't treat our animals like this. It is degrading what has happened. Chantelle has copped so much abuse, it's just... And when she went to the vaccine, she was telling me this story. She went to the vaccine clinic, safety clinic, thinking she was going to be given advice on how to deal with a stroke. Do you know what they wanted her to do? Take the second shot. Take the second shot. She was there with 3 other women about her age, and they were all told the same thing. And when I heard that, I just couldn't believe it, right? And anyway, so then I finally got in touch. I'd made this call a few weeks earlier, but he got back in touch with me, a guy up here, I won't name his name because he wants to stay anonymous, but 31-year-old school teacher, just bought a house, got the AZ shot on a Friday, paralysed down his right-hand side by Tuesday, felt hot over the weekend off, basically has been in a bedridden or in a wheelchair since that time. I think he's managed to sort of get a little bit more mobility back in his right arm and a little bit in his foot. I think he's slowly on the mend, but he's had no income in that time. And the only time he heard from Queensland Health, why did Queensland Health call him? Tell him to get the second shot. And he was trying to explain, well, actually, I got paralysed on the first shot. I don't want the second shot. And of course, he's going to be one of these people impacted by the vaccine mandates, because the doctors are basically being told that they're going to get deregistered. Well, not directly, but are being warned that if they try and undermine the vaccine rollout, then, they could be threatened with deregistration. But of course, the vaccine rollout is a means to an end. And that, of course, is to protect our health. But if the vaccine rollout isn't doing that, then we stop the vaccine rollout, right? It's that simple. Okay. And the third one happened on the Saturday that weekend. I got a message from a bloke saying, look, this is Sienna Knowles. Sienna's very public. I talk to her mother probably every third or fourth day. And Sienna's a 19-year-old girl. I didn't realise at the time, but she's quite well known in equestrian circles, very fit. And she got massive clots in her legs and her lungs. And in the end, it took her about a week and a half to get properly, or maybe 2 weeks to get diagnosed, but she's got a pulmonary embolism. And she's on and off as well, so she hasn't recovered. She's still struggling. And her mother's still struggling. They both got the Pfizer shot. That was the second one, admittedly. Neither of them felt great after the first one, but went ahead and got the second one. They let Sienna drive home when she first went to the hospital on the Friday night. Like, they should never have let her drive with clots in her body. I mean, and they wouldn't, I can't remember, because I get a bit mixed up here, but I'm not sure if they admitted it was the vaccine originally. They wouldn't admit the vaccine, but the same story, and I hear this all the time, they'll admit verbally, but they'll never write it down. The doctors will never write it down. Now, I've also got someone, a whistleblower that I now have within AHPRA, who has told me that doctors are basically being red flagged if they write exemptions. I mean, this is this is it, mate. This is the Orwellian nightmare coming true, unfortunately. And then basically after that, the floodgates open. But, I've got stories of a wonderful, beautiful woman in Tweed Heads who basically is a hairdresser, hasn't been able to work since June, pretty much been paralysed, paying $400 a month for potassium IV injections. Now, I don't know, and she's been bedridden. She's fallen out of bed once, broke her ankle. I spoke to her yesterday. She's on the mend. She can now stand up for a little bit of time, but she has to get back into bed by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's on the mend. In that bad a state that, you're on the mend for a few hours where you can stand on your own 2 feet for a few hours or at least get some mobility. But, you're basically bedridden by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She's about my age. No income since June. We've got this indemnity scheme that doesn't start paying out until next year. Well, Hunt's saying next month, but it may as well be next year. He's only saying next month because I'm pushing it to come forward. Like, it should be open now. And it's an expression of interest. You've got to do an expression of interest. No, it's a compensation claim. Let's stop using the Orwellian terms here. Kicks in at $5,000. So, if you've only spent $4,000, that's tough luck. You're out of money. You're out of pocket for a vaccine that was supposedly safe and effective. And it occurred to me yesterday why they've got such a high threshold is because they're hoping that people below that threshold don't apply, so we don't get to see the true number of people with adverse events. Because we know we can't trust the TGA on so many levels, and we'll get to that one later on. But that would take half the night. We might have to book it in the second one. Don't start me with the TGA. And I'm sure Malcolm would rip that microphone out of my hands and get up here and want to take my spot. I'm not sure where I was going there. So that was Sue Ann. Oh, compensation, sorry, yeah. And then the onus of proof is now on the victim to prove that it was caused by the vaccine. Now, I'm sorry here, but the onus of proof needs to be on the government that it wasn't the vaccine. If you're a fit and able person who's had a serious impact adverse event 28 days after the vaccine, then, or, you know, and 28 days is, you could probably argue a lot later than that, but I'll just say 28 days at this stage. Yeah, it probably needs to be longer, but it's going to get tricky, that one. But there is no question, right? Like, it's got to be, you know, the government needs to prove that it wasn't the vaccine. Now, we're going to come up with a clash heads here. I'm going to clash heads here. We certainly clashed already with Gerard, the head of the TGA, last week. I gave him the example, I was talking to him how this onus of proof's got to change, and I quoted the example of the guy in Toowoomba who got paralysed 3 days after taking his vaccine, and Gerard just came out and said, well, paralysis isn't a side effect of the vaccine. and I was in shock, you know, and I said, how can you say that? And he goes, oh, it's population epidemiology, so many people a year get paralysed. And that's the excuse. And I straight away went back at him and I said, well, hang on, 17,000 a year, 17,000 people died in 2019 from respiratory related diseases. If that's the case, why didn't you use the word population epidemiology with COVID to say that, you know, people die from respiratory disease, right? And look, I don't want to downplay the risk of COVID. Respiratory disease, especially if the infection gets into your lung, is a serious issue, right? We shouldn't be downplaying that, but there's other ways to deal with that apart from just vaccines. And I'll get onto that topic later on. But yeah, we'll get on that topic in a minute. But so, and because I went down that angle of the population epidemiology, I didn't say to him in the meeting, I'm annoyed with myself. But the other thing is, actually, it was my grandfather. I remember he passed away when I was 8. But my memories of my grandfather was lying in the hospital bed at Wandai paralysed because he'd had a stroke from a clot, and I always remember that. And it suddenly occurred to me after the meeting that, you know, paralysis and strokes are caused by clots. And of course, Gerard admits that clots are a recognised side effect. So if they're a recognised side effect, how can you then discount, you know, the flow-on effect from them, you know? So it's just beggars belief that he would say that. But this is the little trick they've got. They're taking the Pfizer trial, and Pfizer said these are the recognised side effects, and if it's not on the list, then we're not going to count it. So, you know, you go to the doctor and say, I think it's caused by, I've got this adverse event that's caused by the vaccine. And the doctor goes, well, here's the list, the recognised side effect, not on there, therefore it's not related to the vaccine. I mean, that's completely absurd, right? I mean, you've got to diagnose the patient, you've got to do a certain number of tests, etc., etc. So, I mean, and I can't, when I'm saying this is a generalisation, so maybe, you know, I'm sure some doctors are out there doing proper tests and, you know, you're going to get a varying array of service from various doctors. And, you know, I suspect, I said this earlier to someone today, you'll have the labour-prone doctors who will say to people, and this is some of the feedback I've got, that it's all in your head. These are comments that have come back. And then you'll have other doctors who are probably feeling very guilty about what's going on and are struggling, you know, with what's going on. But, so, you know, after, and then the following week, I posted Chantelle's story, I posted Sienna's story, and then it just took off there, and I had people contact me, and I put the stories up, and I've been, you know, talking to people basically ever since for about the last 4 weeks, and it, you know, it's terrible. I mean, and if I could summarise, it's the severity of the adverse events, it's how widespread they are, and it's also the treatment that people have been getting. You know, people are being, you know, shunned basically, both by doctors and, you know, I've got, you know, people are attacking me or attacking these people as anti-vaxxers. I mean, that is just disgusting. I mean, these people actually took the vaccine, so they can hardly be called anti-vaxxers. And to break that argument down into a vax versus anti-vax thing, it's like anything. You should, like I always say, judge the individual, not the identity. It's the same for vaccines. You've got to judge each vaccine on its own merits. And I did a post this afternoon quoting numbers out of the World Health Organization adverse event database. There's been more adverse events from this vaccine in the last year than there has been from about 15 other medications, I think vaccines and certain other medications in the last, you know, 4 decades. So we can't ignore the inherent risks in this vaccine, number one. And a lot of those other vaccines are for diseases much worse than COVID in terms of, you know, COVID's got a 99.5. I think the case fatality rate's up to 6 in 1,000 for the Delta this year. It was higher last year for Alpha, but that was skewed by the Victorian health fiasco where, you know, my understanding is that staff were pulled and and couldn't work, and then effectively, people were left in aged care homes understaffed, hence why they didn't get the service. And I don't think they were sent to hospital when they should have been, because there's a bit of an argument coming here, and we've got to deal with this. I'll go slightly off topic. The state government have called an inquiry today, and I actually spoke about this in the party room a few months ago, whereby the state governments are going to start blaming their health system on the federal government, whereby the aged care sector is not good enough, or NDIS isn't good enough. Now, that may be true, but basically they're going to say if someone's an old person in an aged care centre and they're sick, they're going to argue, well, that person can't come to hospital. All right, well, that's not the way it works. Aged care centres aren't hospitals. They're there for healthy old people. Once that person gets sick, they should go to hospital. But the states are going to start passing the buck, like they always do, in terms of not meeting their requirements. So the case fatality rate's about 6 in 1,000. But then on top of that, you've got to remember that if you look at Sweden, they've stayed open pretty much the last 18 months. I think they did have a short, brief lockdown at one point, but they're an example that we can use for what would have happened if we'd stayed open. They've got they've had about 1.1 million cases of COVID, and they've got a population of about 10.5 million people. So their infection rate's been about 1 in 10. The UK is about 1 in 7 or 8. No, they've got 9 million people infected. So about 1 in 7, 1 in 8. The US is about 1 in 7, 1 in 8. So not everyone's going to get COVID as well. And you've got to remember, we're a very sparsely populated country outside of Sydney and Melbourne, and to a lesser extent Brisbane maybe. COVID's not going to spread as rapidly, and we've got a longer, we have shorter winters, they're not as cold, say compared to Sweden, which has got, I think they're 450 million square kilometres, about a quarter the size of Queensland with twice the population. So, whether or not we even had a case fatality rate, well, I wouldn't know, we'll never know. But long story short is that we have to do something about, first and foremost, the indemnity scheme for those people who've suffered adverse events. So, I just, look, I mean, I get, when you join a major party, I know a lot of you guys don't like major parties, and that's fine, I totally get why. I accept, when I decided to run for a major party, that there were times I was going to have to drink the Kool-Aid, and, you're not always going to agree with everything your party does, but there's some things you just can't do, and some things are ideological, but the one thing I can never do is walk away from the well-being and health of the Australian people and the damage, and not, and say nothing while people are being injured and hurt and potentially killed. This has gone beyond politics. It's funny, I was talking to Sue last night, the lady of the tweed heads. She didn't even know what party I was in. She didn't know what party Palaszczuk was in. And I had to explain to her the Senate and stuff like that. And she said, well, I don't care, I'm just going to vote for you. And the beauty of that was, what I really liked about that, it was so refreshing to have a conversation based on true outcomes rather than the ideology and the mudslinging. And I hate the left versus right. I hate politics. I actually hate being a politician. I never thought I'd see the day where I really wish I could go back to being an accountant, sitting in the back room, just crunching numbers and not having to deal with this crap. But I also ran out of frustration through my knowledge of tax and monetary policy, which we can talk about another night. But I'm not going to allow this to happen. It's not just the adverse event injuries, it's the discrimination, it's against people, it's the mandates, it's we're not letting this, I'm going to fight this. The one hill I will die on the most is vaccinating our children. I mean, that is just not needed. And then also, of course, the border crossings. I mean, it's this constant, looking over your shoulder. I mean, I'm still getting used to not needing to wear a mask. I keep thinking, it's still, I've been in quarantine a bit longer, so maybe you guys have got used to it again. But, it's just this whole fear factor, and thinking, and I'm always thinking, I've got to be careful because if I catch COVID, I can't go to Canberra to vote or not vote. And then if I come back, I don't want bring COVID back from Canberra and then give it to my kids. My kids go to school and they get demonised because Dad brought COVID back from Canberra. I know, you shouldn't think like that, but that's sort of the psychology we're living in now, where the pile-on occurs all the time. So I've decided I'm just going to withhold my vote from the coalition until such time as we deal with a number of issues, which I'll outline in a minute. Because until until we deal with the psychosis of COVID, we will never move forward as a country. And, you know, there's arguably some important bills coming over the next few weeks that, you know, I'm going to struggle not to vote for or against, but I will vote against a couple if they do come up. But we just have to nail this. We've got to stop what's going on. We are actually at 84% double jab now for people over 16, right? So if you'd have said to the Prime Minister and the Premiers last year, would you take a country being 84% double jabbed? They would have said yes. So they would have clutched at it with open hands. And that'll probably climb a bit because, you know, there's still some people out there will get. So what is it going to take to get on and get back to the way we were? And an election won't solve it because the election won't solve it. And I want to be clear about this. I'm not trying to bring down the coalition because as frustrated as I get with the coalition, if Labor get in, trust me, they will be worse. Okay, the only consolation is we might get a few more of our guys speaking up that might curtail what they might get away with. But I just think Albanese working in tandem with the likes of Andrews, McGowan and Palaszczuk, they'll be locking down forever and a day, right? This is the thing. It's not about, and I'm not doing so. I'm not trying to achieve, play games or get attention. It's about we've got to get this issue resolved, and there's just nothing else matters to me at the moment until we get that resolved because it's impacting our lives on so many levels. And before I go into these issues, I'll touch as I'll go through. So obviously the five demands that I've put to the Prime Minister, and I sort of wish I'd put a few more, but I'll touch on them after, is obviously this indemnity scheme, right? I don't care what it takes. We've got to look after those people who've been injured. We've spent over $300 billion on keeping people safe from COVID. If it is going to cost $10 billion in compensation to help these people, that's what we spent. Right? There's no trade-off there, right? And as I said, the RBA prints $4 billion a week, although we're printing $5 billion. It's like, not that I condone, the money printing, but if we can print money for COVID, we can print money to save these people, right? So we can't be shortchanging them, number one. Number two is we can't make people lose their jobs over these mandates. It's just not right. Now look, I'll be honest, if you went and started a job and they said to you part of your job was to get a vaccine because that's what we need in the job, I could live with it on two conditions. Number one, the thing was safe and effective. So if it was a tetanus shot, or I think with the abattoir workers, they have to get a Q fever shot, I'm told. But they sign up to that. They're told they've got to get a Q fever shot. They go, sure. I'm not sure what the safety profile of the Q fever shot is, but I haven't heard sort of horror stories about it, so I assume it's safe. I can live with that, right? And so in terms of hospital and aged care centres, if they're told they've got to take a safe and effective vaccine, which I don't think includes the COVID-19 vaccines, I could live with it if they were upfront about it, right? But they can't change the law halfway through because that's double standards. And we know that because basically Peter Reid lost his court case a few weeks ago because it was what is in his contract. He wasn't technically wrong for speaking out. He got in trouble not for what he said about the reef and accusing the other people of not being correct about their research. It was the fact that speaking out was against his contract, right? So because, if they're going to apply, well, what's in your contract, then they need to apply that here. And if it's not in your contract and it's not stipulated what vaccine's in your contract, that's it. So they've got to be consistent. Number three is I don't think people, and this is kind of fits in with the mandate, but a little bit more specific. You cannot make people who had an adverse event from any vaccine in the past, but particularly from the COVID ones, like Matt that I just mentioned before from Toowoomba or Chantelle, get a second one. Like that is just inhumane, right? I mean, why if they'd been injured? And, it's interesting. I've got another lady who I posted her video. She's pro-vax. She got her daughter vaccinated. She was feeling ill after her first shot and a bit wobbly in the legs and thought, I think it's the vaccine. And then she went and saw the doctors and they said, no, it's not the vaccine. You had an underlying condition. She trusted her doctor, went and got the second shot, got the neurological disorder, can't walk, et cetera, et cetera. She can sort of walk with a wobbling stick and wobbles, but even then she wasn't annoyed about taking the second shot because she thought she was the 1 in a million chance. What ticked her off was she lodged an adverse event claim with the TGA, only to be called up about a month later by the TGA and said, no, your injury isn't caused by the vaccine. And she was like, but hang on, you haven't even diagnosed me. You haven't even spoken on the phone to me or anything. You've just rung me up and said it's not related. And so, ironic, it's funny how different things tick off different people. But she was of the view, that's what ticked her off, was like, hang on, you're not taking this seriously. So you just can't make people get the third shot. Sorry, the second shot. If they've had an adverse, or the third shot. The fourth condition was, I just see no reason to give it to our children. Right? We've had over 60,000 people, children, or 50,000. I think it's almost 60. It was 50,000 a few weeks ago, so it's probably close to 60,000 children under 20 get COVID. And there's been 2 that have passed away with COVID. One had meningitis, I think, and I didn't know what the other comorbidity was, but I just think that it's still being, we've got bad data, if you ask me, in terms of safety profile. We've already now, even the mainstream of media that admit that it transmits just as, it doesn't make much difference if you're vaccinated or unvaccinated in terms of transmission, and you can still catch it. So, what's the point, period? But even more so with our children, who, by the way, have less what they call ACE receptors on a cell. So that's the receptor that the COVID virus binds to, and that's why children are less inclined to get seriously ill from COVID. So it's not only statistically they don't get it, they actually understand the mechanism for why they don't get it. It's well understood. Now, what's particularly frustrating about this is in the October 20 TGA report, there was a 14-year-old girl who's been a reported death from Moderna. Now, it's a reported death, so, technically we can't, prove causation, and I don't have all the data, say that it is. But surely, if you've got a child who's a reported death from the vaccine, you using the precautionary principle that has been used against us for every other thing in COVID, wouldn't you use that with our children? If you were ever going to use the precautionary principle, you would use it on our children. So shouldn't the rollout of the vaccines for children be, at very least, I'd stop it, but at the very least paused until they investigated that? And yet, it still rolls on. And, Hunt's talking about he's invited the Pfizer to apply for approval for 5 to 11-year-olds. Well, I've got 3 children between 4 and 9. So, this is going to be the hill that I die on with those vaccinations for children. I don't care. And not only, even if it is optional, we've got children now who can't go to their school formals in New South Wales and Victoria because their parents don't want them vaccinated. So not only are we, if you don't want to expose them to them, they're being discriminated against. I mean, since when do you discriminate against children? This is, I've been told by insiders in the New South Wales place. That's why they pushed the New South Wales opening back to December 15, was so that all the kids who wanted to go to schoolies would have to get vaccinated. Like that was their thinking. To get the numbers up. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. Well, actually, you can, because when it comes to bureaucrats, they will make any rule possible. If there's a rule doesn't exist, they'll push it and then make it a rule. They'll just invent something out of thin air for the sake of it. So, and the last condition was, the borders need to open. Even with the Palmer High decision, which I disagree with, but the High Court judges ruled that if there's a risk of people getting sick and it's unknown, you can apply the precautionary principle and therefore allow the premiers to shut the borders. Now, I disagreed with it at the time because free intercourse amongst the states means just that, right? It wasn't, free intercourse amongst the states, but this and this. It was just free intercourse, right? Well, given now that we're 84% jabbed, given that we now know that the case fatality rate is no higher than the mortality rate in 2019, which was 6.9 people per 1,000, so the case fatality rate from COVID isn't higher than the mortality rate, and notwithstanding that, you're only, assume using Sweden's figures, you've got a 1 in 10 chance of catching it anyway, so your case fatality rate at this stage is 6 in 10,000. Well, enough's enough. So the government really needs to go back to the High Court and say, we think the Premier should open. If it was left to me, I think we should have told Clive Palmer not to go to the High Court last year. We should have done it as the federal government. We should have been seen as the national government protecting our country, right? Because at the end of the day, I was born in Queensland, I was raised in Queensland. I love Queensland, but I'm always an Australian first and foremost. The only divides, as I like to say, between, the states should be between, Aussie rules and rugby league, Holdens and Fords, and effectively the type of beer you drink, and unfortunately we don't have any divides anymore with the cars, the grog's not quite like it used to be. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But this division between the states and the division between the vaccinated and unvaccinated has got to stop. It's too far. There are a couple of other things that I think are worth addressing. Obviously I've spoken about the health impact. We've got the cost of COVID, which is $1 trillion. And then we've got, with these vaccine mandates, they're also creating a legal minefield. Because the idea that an employer or an employee can be responsible for an airborne virus, in my mind, is just absurd. How on earth are you going to trace where these people, if someone catches COVID, where they caught it from? And then we're asking the employees and the employers who've just come out of 18 months of lockdowns and, having seen their businesses destroyed and their livelihood destroyed. These governments are now asking, the state governments are now asking the businesses to police their laws. They've got enough problems on their own, of their own plate to then have, asking, and that impacts the employee as well. I mean, you might have a diminutive waitress who, is serving coffees and that, and then you're asking her to tell some 6'2" unvaccinated guy, who's, doesn't like having his privacy invaded about his health records. And, I can understand why he'd be upset about that. But, you don't want to put that, a person, it's not fair to ask a person to police that. You're putting them at risk as well. It's a legal minefield as well, these mandates, as well as a civil, destruction of civil liberties, as well as, you're risking people, you're risking, and this blanket vaccination approach, I don't agree with it, right? Because you're asking 20 million people to expose themselves to vaccine injury risk. As I just said, 1 in 10 people, assuming the Sweden's infection fatality rate, and then 1% of people of that, so say 1 in 10,000 people might get seriously ill from COVID, or say 2 in 10,000. Wouldn't we be much better off treating them with various treatments, and ivermectin's a word? There's other treatments as well, right? Like there's dexamethasone if you get really crook, and there's other steroids they can give them. And focus on them, because at the end of the day, you don't protect the weak by destroying the strong. And I don't want to impute motive tonight, but there is no reason to destroy the strong if you want to protect people's health. So we can't do that. The other thing that needs to happen is we need to clean out some of the bureaucrats who caused this in the first place. And of course, the top of that, the head of that, of course, is Skerritt, Professor Skerritt, who, in my view, I feel as though if he hasn't deliberately lied to me, and I can't say that he has, but I feel as though he has misled me on a number of occasions. One good example of where I think he's going to get himself into very big trouble, and I advertise this fact. He said to John Laws earlier this year around July that the vaccines are 99.999%, was that 4 nines after the dot, safe. Okay? So in other words, he's implied that 1 in a million people would have an adverse event. Now, given that 20 million people have had, let's assume 20 million people get 2 shots, that would be 20 people who've had adverse, well, that's not the case at all, right? We've had at least 10,000 applied to the indemnity scheme. We've got 77,000 on the TGA database. They may not all be serious adverse events, but I also would suspect that, those adverse events are severely underreported. I mean, I've spoken to people who have had, severe myocarditis and various other ailments that the doctors won't write an adverse event report for. And other, other people have been told by the TGA that it wasn't related to the vaccine. So, that in itself, the 99.999 should see the back of Skerritt. If he's going to keep running this strokes and paralysis isn't a side effect of the vaccine, that's another reason why he's gone. Another reason why I think he should go is he told me, I called Greg Hunt the night, I think it was about the 1st of September or the 2nd of September, on that Friday afternoon when the TGA banned ivermectin. I organised a meeting through Greg Hunt that weekend to talk to Skerritt on the Monday morning. He said he banned it because he didn't think that it was being issued in safe doses. So I asked him, I said, well, what's the dosage that you've got a problem with? And he had a problem with 12 milligrams a day, right? So he thought, so apparently for the River Lice or the River one or that one, it's 4 milligrams a day or something, right? But unbeknownst to me, I got on the phone, and I didn't know enough to know at that point about the actual dosages, so I got on the phone back to Tom DeBrody. Tom sent me a paper by a bloke called Guzzo, a toxicology report, that showed that you could do 30, 60 and 90 over day 1, day 4 and day 7 or something like that, and they could also tolerate up to 100 milligrams in one hit safely. And then I also got a document sent to me later that week that was prepared by Merck, the maker of ivermectin, sent to the TGA that said you could do 30, 60 and 90 on day 1, 4 and 7 and also do one dose of 120 milligrams, and that was safe, right? Since then, I've had people from the military contact me when they went on overseas assignments whereby they were given 6 3 milligram tablets to take, so i.e. 18 milligrams. I had a warrant officer. When I put that photo up of what was there, I was contacted the next day by a warrant officer who was a medical officer in the army. He said, we used to hand out ivermectin, we'd never had any problems whatsoever. And then we've got the big, and this is the one that really frustrates me, and the one that really ticked me off early on was Kylie Wagstaff, who was a professor at Monash University back in 2012, 2013, demonstrated in the laboratory that ivermectin could inhibit the important protein that carries viruses through the endoplasmic reticulum into the nucleus. Now that's very, very important because you've got a cell, you've got a membrane, then you've got the cytoplasm, and then you've got the nucleus. The nucleus is where all your DNA is stored. And a retrovirus, which is what the coronavirus is, it comes back into the cell, goes through the cytoplasm, and it's carried, you need certain proteins to carry it through their endoplasmic reticulum into the nucleus, right? If that protein, if ivermectin could inhibit the protein that does that transport, like it's a cargo protein, transports the virus into the nucleus where it then can then replicate, it stops, it's dead, right? So, you get what you call epidemic or statistics where you do trials and you look at people, and then you also look at things in the laboratory, right? Now, they understand the pathway of the virus and they understand that ivermectin inhibits that. Surely that in itself is worth investigating. Now, Skerritt constantly says there's no evidence that ivermectin works, right? Now, we've got obvious examples like Uttar Pradesh, Indonesia and Japan that I can list now. I don't like to quote them as proof because I don't know how the numbers work and I'm not familiar with how well they calculate the data. I mean, so that would seem suggestive that it works, but I think the big crunch one is what worked in the lab. Now, then the question becomes, the doses in the lab are too high. I went back to Tom Barodi and Robert Clancy with that. They say, no, it's not too high. These guys work in this stuff all the time. These guys, Tom Barodi has 67 staff working for him. He earns his money from patents, patients and private donations. He's not a career bureaucrat like Skerritt is. And, one of the things that also annoys me about the ivermectin argument is they say, it's horse paste. Why would you use something that's used on horses? Well, Gerard is an agricultural scientist, right, who then did a pharmacology PhD later on. So if you're going to mock ivermectin for being related to veterinary practices, then what about Gerard? I mean, it's, they're having it both ways there. So that bit really frustrates me, that we've never looked at, and it's as though, and the reason why it's also important, apart from the fact that it might work and that we know it's safe, is that it's cheap, I mean, and this is another argument I'm going to use about that indemnity scheme. We've dropped $8 billion alone on vaccines and booster shots. And, the other red flag going off in my head, we bought 150 million booster shots for a country of 25 million people. Not kosher on that one. I'm not sure if we paid for that 150 billion. I will qualify that, but the fact that we've even felt the need to get 6 booster shots on top of the 2, and we haven't even rolled out Novavax yet, or Covax, Nikolai Petrovsky's one. So anyway, I guess I'll leave it at that. But anyway, next week's the week. My good friend and colleague Alex Antic has jumped on board, as well as One Nation. I'm yet to have a discussion with the ministers in any meaningful way. I mean, the Prime Minister indicated today that people shouldn't have to have be mandates. The mandates shouldn't exist. I suspect that he did that to test the waters and get feedback on that. Look, take all this with a grain of salt. The Courier Mail poll that had about 4,000 people was 2-1 in favour of the Prime Minister. I would like to think that the support is with us. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that there's been 18 months of fear-mongering by the premiers, where they've stood up every day from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock. 9 o'clock Queensland, 10 o'clock New South Wales, 11 o'clock Andrews, and then 12 o'clock WA on occasions, or the ACT. A lot of people have been, are terrified of COVID. Look, we should treat it seriously, but there are a lot of people, and the scary thing for me about Queensland is that we're yet to actually have our COVID moment. Right? We have not opened up, right? Like it's coming, and all we've done in the last 18 months is kick the can down the road and cause a lot of heartache, destroy society, destroy livelihoods. Luckily up here our kids haven't lost too much schooling, but family, our loved ones have been kept apart. We've divided our country on so many levels. Let's be honest, I think we're not the same laid-back country we were, even a few years ago. And at this stage, we're yet to face our moment of truth. So I fear that if COVID cases take off again, Palaszczuk, regardless of what level of vaccination we're at, she's going to lock down again. And that will just only delay the inevitable. So we're going to have to, and I personally think the sooner we open up throughout summer, and not winter, the better. But anyway, look, so we've got that in front of us. But look, that's enough from me. I am happy to take questions from the audience.